Per reports, the Mariners have fired longtime manager Scott Servais. Our reaction to the news coming up here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. Colby, hit it.
You are Locked On Mariners, your daily Seattle Mariners podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ahoy, sailors. It is Thursday, August 22nd, 2024. This is Ty Gonzalez and Colby Patnode for the Locked On Mariners podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. According to Ken Rosenthal of The Athletic, the Mariners have fired longtime manager Scott Servais and will name Mariners Hall of Famer Dan Wilson as the interim manager for the remainder of the year. Got a lot to talk about, but before we get into it all, shout out to our title sponsor today, Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONMLB. Terms apply. And if you want to hear from me and Colby even more and help support the show, check out our Patreon. The link is in the description. You can sign up for a free 7-day trial. So when things go the way they have gone for the last 2 or so months, you blow a 10-game division lead in record fashion, you go 1-8 on a crucial road trip, things like this can happen. And it's happened. Now, I am a bit surprised considering what we talked about yesterday. His contract's up at the end of the year. You could just choose not to retain him. You could let this rock for the rest of the year. I thought they were going to do that, but no, they've gone ahead and they've reportedly fired Scott Servais. This has also been corroborated by Ryan Divish of the Seattle Times. He's now reporting the same thing as Rosenthal. So it's all but confirmed at this point. There's supposed to be an official announcement by the team later today. That might happen by the time you're listening to this. We'll see. So stunned isn't necessarily the right word. Sad isn't necessarily the right word, but I would just say that it really sucks that we've gotten to this point with the Mariners organization. And this is a point we've gotten to with a lot of Seattle sports teams over the last 7-8-ish months. Pete Carroll, obviously, essentially fired by the Seattle Seahawks, even though they didn't call it that. That's what happened. Dave Haxtell fired by the Kraken. Kalen DeBoer leaves UW. Hopkins gets fired from UW men's basketball. Been a lot of turnover on coaching staffs in the city of Seattle this year. And Scott Servais now the latest. We're going to get into the Dan Wilson aspect of this a little later on in the show. But Colby, your reaction, Scott Servais getting fired.
Yeah, I would say I'm bummed. Like it is a bit of a sad day because, Scott, for all of his, flaws, and he certainly wasn't a perfect manager. That doesn't exist. Second winningest manager in franchise history, second longest tenured manager in franchise history. Mm-hmm. He oversaw an incredibly important part of the franchise. And not only did he break the playoff drought, not only was he a part of that staff, but he also hung through the rebuild, and he rebuilt culture a couple different times. And he was always very outspoken and supportive of his players, of his coaching staff, sometimes maybe to a fault, but he always had his guys back, and so it's sad. And I started covering this team in some form or fashion right around the time that Scott was fired. So he's the only manager I've covered.
Hired.
He's the only manager that I've really covered. So yeah, it's a bummer. It really is, because I think, we can talk about whether or not this needed to happen or whether or not this was inevitable and all that stuff, but we can do it respectfully. We can do it without some of the name calling that we've seen. We can do it, with the idea that, there's a very good chance that Scott Servais is one day going to end up in the Mariners Hall of Fame. And we can say that he probably earned that. He probably deserved that. You don't even have to look back that far to see how much Servais means to a lot of players. Look at Victor Robles's comments when he signed his extension only 10 days ago. Like, he loved that Scott let him be himself, and he he was very appreciative of the culture that Scott Servais had kind of cultivated. And it's not just Robles. You look at Julio, you look at JP, you look at Cal, and these guys allowed to be themselves and asked to be themselves, and the kind of positive vibes that created for a very long time. And now just to see it kind of crash as quickly as it did. Again, we can talk about whether or not it's deserved or earned, or if it was just a move they had to make and all that stuff. We can talk about all that, but at the end of the day, Scott Servais is the manager of the Seattle Mariners for the first time in almost 9 full years. It's a sad day, and I think it's easy to point to like, oh well, he bunted too much, or oh well, he didn't manage the bullpen well here, blah blah blah. At the end of the day, this is the guy who not only took the brunt of a lot of anger from fans over the last 9 years. He saw this team through a rebuild, broke through, ended the playoff drought, something that Bob Melvin didn't do, something that Eric Wedge didn't do, that Lloyd McClendon didn't do. Like
Don Wakamatsu.
Yeah, he was the guy who did it, and he's also the guy that created a culture that meant something to be a Mariner. It meant something different. He decided to, I play for the Mariners, to be like, I'm a Seattle Mariner. And he made something cool about that. And so, or he was part of it at the very least.
Scott Servais helped cultivate an actual identity for the Seattle Mariners, which they had sorely lacked for a long time.
And in kind of a strange way, he kind of contributed to this. He raised the expectation of us, the Mariner fans, to the point where he was fired today, because what's happening on the field isn't acceptable to us anymore. Where when you look at the Wedge era, you look at the McClendon era, this would just be like, oh, that's just the Mariners, whatever. And it's not that we didn't ask for those people to be fired. It's not that they didn't deserve to be fired, but it's just, imagine like the resume that Scott's put up for the last 4 years. Imagine if Wakamatsu had done that, or if Wedge had done that, and then, and then we're fired. Like it's different. He has raised the bar, I think, of this fan base. And I hope that's part of his legacy, that he has kind of raised what our expectation levels should be going forward. And I know there's cynics out there who say he didn't do that for me, but I've seen plenty of people go from, oh, the same old Mariners, they're never going to win, to, they've gone from apathy to like anger.
People actually expect success. They
Right.
expect greatness out of the organization.
They care.
2022 changed a lot, right?
Yep.
And it wasn't just ending the drought. It was ending the drought, going into the playoffs, actually winning a playoff series.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you got
with the best team in baseball.
Yeah, you got swept by the Astros, but you were right there on the doorstep in that series, and you could taste it. And that's what makes last year so painful. That's what's made this year so painful, because when Jeremy Pena hit that home run in the 18th inning in Seattle in Game 3 of the ALDS, you were thinking, well, we'll be back, right? We'll be back, and we haven't gotten there, and that's part of the reason that we're where we're at right now, talking about Scott Servais being fired. And you look at this clubhouse, right? The thing we've always talked about with Scott that has separated him as a manager is how he has handled the clubhouse, how he has been able to cultivate culture, right? Mm-hmm. And been able to maintain culture, right? And being able to elevate guys and let guys be the best version of themselves. And this year, from the outside looking in, that hasn't been as present, right? We've heard a lot of players talk about a lack of urgency, a lack of energy in the clubhouse. And those are things that we haven't really heard about a Scott Servais clubhouse more often than not. And so, we heard Jerry DiPoto talk about it yesterday in that article with Ken Rosenthal, who of course broke the news today that, maybe it was time for a new voice, right? And that is probably at least part of the reason why it's Dan Wilson who's taken over and not one of the guys that's already on the coaching staff. So we'll get into that in just a moment here. But first, a reminder, this episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast is brought to you by Tonal. For those of us who thrive on getting stuff done, including workouts, every minute counts. That's why you need Tonal, the smart strength training system that takes the guesswork out of working out so you can make sure you're making the most out of every rep. Tonal is the world's smartest and most effective strength training system that helps you get stronger. Powered by AI, Tonal learns with every rep so it can deliver workouts personalized just for you. Tonal learns from your movement and provides suggested weight recommendations for every move with detailed progress reports. They even create personalized program and workout suggestions or recommendations based on your individual goals. It's like having a personal trainer at home with you, as Tonal will optimize every workout just for you. Unlike traditional gym equipment, Tonal uses adaptive digital weight to advance your training techniques. From professional athletes to the Mama 3, Tonal is trusted by thousands who have become their strongest. Right now, Tonal is offering our listeners $200 off your Tonal purchase with promo code LOCKEDONMLB. That's Tonal.com and use promo code LOCKEDONMLB. That's LOCKEDONMLB for $200 off your purchase. That's Tonal.com, promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $200 off. And you're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Tomorrow night, you can catch the first game of the Dan Wilson era between the Mariners and the Giants on the Mariners hometown broadcast with SiriusXM via the SXM app. All you have to do to find that is search the word Mariners. So the Mariners Hall of Famer, Mariners legend himself, Dan Wilson, is now the Mariners interim manager. He has, of course, served as a special assignment coordinator for the Mariners and has been on the broadcast a lot, especially last year when Mike Blowers wasn't available. So you've heard from Dan a lot, and I've seen Dan's name come up a lot with people in the comments, and I've kind of likened this hire to the level of fan casting that was John Krasinski as Mr. Fantastic and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Because this, it almost doesn't feel real. Because again, I've seen so many fans say, "Hey, Dan Wilson should be the manager," which that typically doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, and Griffey should be the hitting coach, and Jamie Moyer should be the pitching coach, and it's like that's all fantasy, and honestly, it's all garbage.
So that's where we are right now. Dan Wilson is now being tasked with bringing in what seems to be a much needed fresh voice, new voice in the clubhouse. And as I said, just a minute ago, I feel like that's at least partly the reason that this isn't Christopher Negron, this isn't Manny Acta, this isn't, Perry Hill, Pete Woodworth, Carson Vitale, any of those guys that are currently on the Mariners coaching staff, that are part of, the Scott Servais staff, right, that are taking over as interim manager here. So you feel the same way, or do you think this might indicate that they just don't think Negron is the guy long term, or they don't think Acta is the guy long term, et cetera?
I think a good part of this is not wanting to move somebody off of their current role and have them kind of learn a new role. They kind of want to keep everybody where they're at. This late into the season, it'd be a little tough to be like, "Oh, by the way, Manny Acta, you're now manager," which means we need somebody to take over your responsibilities, which means we need somebody to take over the person who's doing your responsibility, and we need them to take over. And you just kind of get that chain reaction, right? So you just kind of put a guy at the top, and we know that the Mariners game plans and all that stuff is very collaborative. How they use the bullpen is very collaborative anyways. So they just kind of need a guy to pull the triggers. So they didn't necessarily need to, disrupt everything when they could just swap out one guy essentially and keep everybody else in their roles that they've done all year. So I think it's mostly that. It is an interesting choice because Manny Acta does have managerial experience, a lot of it, and has, for quite a while been kind of a dark horse favorite of a lot of baseball writers and a lot of front office guys. They like Manny Acta. They think he, given the right opportunity, could be a good manager. So, and that's a pretty easy choice to make. And obviously we know that the Mariners like Negron a lot. They think he is a future manager, and odds are he's probably on their short list of guys to interview this winter when they go to fill this job for real. But again, do you want him to come in now with the interim tag, or do you want, if you think you might hire him, do you want him to come in with a fresh, clean slate, come in? But you could also argue that, hey, why not just give Negron this 5-week, on the job training if you think you might hire him. But possibly maybe Seattle doesn't want to hire Negron, but they also want to keep him. So they don't want to put him in a spotlight where he could, win some games and all that stuff. So yeah, it is an interesting decision. It really was going to be, if it was going to be somebody on the staff getting promoted, it was going to be Acta or it was going to be Negron. Those are the two that carry the most, managerial traits, so to speak. Obviously they weren't going to promote Jared DeHart to manager. I don't, even if they thought he could be one day,
that'd be hilarious.
It's a PR thing that you can't take right now though. So yeah, Dan is the guy who's been around the clubhouse the most. He's been around the org a lot. This isn't one of those things where it's like, oh, it's Griffey and he pops up once during spring training and he goes to Everett once in a while. No, this is Dan. He's working with these guys in the minor league level.
He's developed some great relationships with guys on the team, including Cal Raleigh. That's been mentioned a lot here as this whole thing has been reported.
Right. Dan's there every spring training. He's been, going to Everett, going to Modesto, going to Arkansas for years now. So somewhere along the way, he's talked to pretty much everybody on this team and has some kind of a relationship with them. So from that sense, it makes a lot of sense. And obviously Dan, longtime catcher in this league, that's kind of the favorite, on the job training for managers is if you caught in the big leagues like Scott Servais. We know that he's, a pretty smart guy. It'll be interesting to see how he interprets information, like how he implements it. Don't really know if he's like heavily invested in the advanced analytics or whatever, but again, he is there to just kind of serve as, just the manager, like literally the manager as his underlings. Or
I'm interested to see how much reign he actually has, right? Because we've talked about this. This is a collaborative effort. This applied to Scott Servais as well, right? Scott had the final say on things, but there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Now, does that become even more prevalent with Dan Wilson at the helm, or is he basically, it's just the same thing as Scott?
Right. Like ultimately Scott has to pull the trigger on the moves, but pretty much every move that was made in the Scott Servais era was more or less determined pregame, like, well in advance, essentially, because that's what they do. They go over the stats, they go over the numbers, they go over potential matchups off the bench, and all this stuff is thought out and it's well orchestrated in advance. And sometimes that, to me, that looks like that's to the detriment, because I don't think Scott was a great improviser. So if things don't go right, off the jump and you have to kind of change plans mid-course, I don't think Scott was particularly good at that. Is Dan going to be better at it? I don't know. I don't really know, but what'll be interesting to see is at the end, when this is all over, we'll see how it goes. I don't know, maybe the Mariners win, 11 of their next 13, and all of a sudden they're tied with the Astros going into that series, blah, blah, blah. Right. Like stranger things have happened. The Cardinals, 2 years ago, won like 14 games in a row at the end of the season to get into the playoffs. Like, stuff can still happen. It's unlikely, but stuff can still happen there. And if it does,
you are 5 back of the Astros, but the Astros are about to go on a gauntlet of a schedule. So this is your opportunity. This is your last chance. Like if you're going to do this, this is your last chance.
Yeah, starting tonight with a 4-game set against the Orioles. They're facing Corbin Burns tonight. So, it's, you hope the Orioles win at least 3 or 4, and then maybe you can win. Maybe you sweep the Giants, and all of a sudden you're 2.5 back instead of 5. And at that point, it's a very real conversation, because you're entering September and it's, oh, hey, we're within 3 games and we got 3 games left against them, blah, blah, blah. But whatever. At the end of the day, we'll see if Dan Wilson is literally just here to ride out the string, or if they think he could be a legitimate candidate for the job long-term. And so this interim tag may get removed if they like what he does or what he doesn't. So I think ultimately he's far enough removed from the org that it is like a new voice. Like it does officially count as a new voice. It's different than Scott. Whereas Acta, Negron, maybe not. But he has also been close enough to the org that he kind of understands the clubhouse. He understands, most of the players. He has a relationship with them at some point, but also it's a fresh perspective. So I think Wilson just kind of threads that needle a little bit here, where it's, a new face, a new voice, a new direction, but it's also somebody who's very familiar with the players and kind of the organization and the clubhouse and all that stuff. So I do think Wilson just kind of threads that needle, and then we'll see if he's a legitimate candidate. I don't know. But obviously with Scott gone, the Mariners are going to in theory, start interviewing and start lining up candidates immediately after their season ends. So we'll have to wait and see if Dan's on that list or not. I don't know. I don't know if this is a kind of a tryout for the Mariners to see if they think Wilson could be a manager, or if this is just, hey, this is a guy who threads the needle. He's discussed, maybe wanting to get back into baseball in a more full-time role. And maybe this doesn't lead to him being the manager of the Mariners. Maybe it leads to him being a bench coach somewhere, or bullpen coach, or
right.
Maybe in Seattle, maybe somewhere else. But Dan is obviously he's a fan favorite too, so he's going to have that kind of buffer from the fan base, who's going to be less prone to criticize him, particularly now where everybody's so down anyways, and most people think it's over, so whatever. I do think there are a lot of reasons they went with Dan Wilson, whether or not it's because they see him as a potential full-time manager for this club next year. I have no idea. I don't have a good feel for that. But I do think that his hiring makes a lot of sense. But it is still noteworthy that they went with him instead of Negron, who I think they plan to interview for the managerial job this winter, and Manny Acta, who has tons of experience as a major league manager. I think it's interesting that they went a different direction.
Well, Colby, for the first time in our time covering this team together, we're going to have to start looking at actual managerial candidates potentially. I mean, again, maybe Dan Wilson is the guy long term. We'll have to see over the next 5 or so weeks. But there's obviously going to be other names that we'll have to look at. We're not going to do that today. I just feel like that would be in poor taste, but we're going to have plenty of time to do that over the next several months. So don't worry. You guys will get your managerial speculation fill, if you will.
Yep.
But we're going to keep on just reacting to this news here in just a moment. But first, a reminder, this episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast is brought to you by SupplyHouse and Game Time. Get supplies from the site that's made for the skilled trades, SupplyHouse.com. SupplyHouse.com is the reliable way to order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Shop a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands and get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. Need help with an order? Get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business, and talk to a real person every time. Pros in the skilled trades can get a competitive edge by joining SupplyHouse.com's free Trade Master program. Every Trade Master gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free membership at SupplyHouse.com/TM and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at SupplyHouse.com. Some of you may not know this, but I used to live in a state where there were no professional sports teams, and a lot of artists and bands skipped over it on their respective tours. Then I moved to Toronto about 6 or so years ago, where there's pro baseball, basketball, hockey, even soccer. And almost every night there's great music being played somewhere in the city. And anytime my wife and I go to a game or a show, I get our tickets through Game Time. I truly am not just saying this because they're sponsoring the show. They are legitimately the best ticket service out there, in my opinion. I used Game Time well before they became a sponsor here on Locked On, and well before I even became a part of Locked On. So I was thrilled when I found out that they were sponsoring our show and sponsoring our network as a whole. And I have personally never found a better deal elsewhere, especially the day of the event. And that's thanks to their lowest price guarantee. I also get to see the exact view I'm paying for, and I know exactly what I'm paying up front with their all-in prices, which eliminates all those, annoying little surprise fees you find elsewhere. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And you're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Tomorrow night, you can catch the first game of the Dan Wilson era between the Mariners and the Giants on the Mariners hometown broadcast with SiriusXM via the SXM app. All you have to do to find that is search the word Mariners. So I want to try and keep things positive here on the show. Obviously, this is not a great day in the lore of the Seattle Mariners. Whether you wanted Scott Servais fired or not, ultimately you don't want to be at this point where you're firing your manager, right? We'd much rather be in the heat of a pennant race right now, which maybe the Mariners can still get involved in. Probably not, but maybe they can still get involved in over the next 5 weeks. But yeah, right now things are not great, but I don't want to end on a depressing note, which unfortunately a lot of these shows have been ended on because of the way this team has played. But no matter how you feel about Scott Servais, he's obviously a very important piece of the story of this franchise, especially over the last 9 years and especially over the last 3 or so years. Ending the drought. I mean, he's the manager that was at the helm of ending the longest playoff drought in professional sports. Like, there is something for that, right? There's something to that. So I wanted to just kind of go over, favorite memories, anything that really just, you want to say about Scott. I mean, I don't know if Scott or anyone in his family listens to the show, but I do know we do have this great platform at our disposal here. So if anyone that knows Scott or is related to Scott, or if you're Scott yourself watching this, or if he's watching, Colby, anything you would like to say to Scott?
Sure. First and foremost, thank you. You took the Mariners from a really dark place, and you gave fans hope for a long, long time. So thank you for that. Thank you for the willingness to take arrows for things that weren't your fault. Ultimately, I'm sure that he doesn't think this way, but ultimately the players got you fired. You are a scapegoat for what has been a disappointing year for a lot of people, a lot of players, and a lot of fans. So, I know that's part of the gig when you're a manager, or really a coach on any professional level. A lot of the times you're a scapegoat, and it sucks. And you accept that reality when you take the job, but it still sucks nonetheless. So, thank you for your efforts. I really appreciate how you built up a culture. You've raised the bar of what is acceptable, from this franchise. I think you've had a huge part in that. And, it's from the stuff like, backing your players when they refuse to play in 2020 because of the George Floyd stuff. It's the, allowing players and telling players to be themselves and find joy in the game and always act like you would when you were a kid playing this game. And just seeing a baseball team that for the most part looks like they actually want to be there. They love the game and they're living out their dream. And I think your culture had a lot to do with that. And obviously, it's the drought buster, man. Like, you laid down the groundwork for that 6 years before it could happen, 7 years before it could happen. And, you took a lot of lumps. You had to manage a very, veteran clubhouse for a few years. And there was a lot of resentment and a lot of, keeping your methods at arm's length there that we know about. And there were some issues in the clubhouse early on. And then you had to sit through the rebuild and just take a lot of losses and have a couple rough years. Obviously getting through, the pandemic season was extremely difficult, and you came out the other side and the Mariners started winning almost immediately after that. And then, obviously the night the drought ended, always going to be a core memory for me. I was there. I always going to remember the post-game speech that you gave.
The voice crack.
Tonight we party. Yeah. And obviously, the big series win in Toronto. Like, there are a lot of positive memories of the Scott Servais era. And, even though I did a lot of things that I'm not a fan of on the field in particular, his stupid games, stupid prizes became a common tweet of mine over the years. The insistence on asking guys who can't bunt to bunt all that stuff. I'm going to do that with every manager. The next Mariners manager is going to feel my wrath on Twitter, probably in the first couple weeks of when it happens.
Everyone is very aware of your wrath on Twitter.
Yeah, I know. It's a very scary thing. But yeah, I mean, like, ultimately, I would just want Scott to know that I'm appreciative of his time that he spent here, of the effort he built into rebuilding not only this clubhouse, not only the culture of the franchise, but in building up the expectation level of us, the fans, when we were, many of us were just apathetic to the idea that we deserved, better, or that we could get better. We could see this thing through. And I think you raised the bar, and I hope your legacy ultimately is one of a good guy, all around good guy, great dad energy, good manager, and somebody who raised the level of discussion, raised the level of awareness, raised the level of pride in being a Seattle Mariner. And I hope that's your legacy. I know that's how I'll look at you. And I just, again, thank you. It's going to be very weird to cover this team with somebody else calling the shots, but I hope I hope we see you at a Mariners Hall of Fame induction sometime in the future, and it'll be well earned. So thank you, Scott, and thanks for everything. It is much appreciated by me.
Yeah. I would echo all of the things that you just said and add, thank you for your hand in reinvigorating my love for this team. And, thank you for your hand in some of my greatest memories as a fan of this team. And by all accounts, and, I never got a chance to meet Scott or talk to Scott. Maybe that opportunity will eventually come one day down the road, but by all accounts, Scott's a good man, and a good father, just a really good people person. Right. And so I'm appreciative of the fact that, and proud of the fact that the Mariners, at the very least, had a good person, at the helm of this thing. Because there are a lot of not great people in professional sports and baseball in general. So it's rare to kind of find someone that's genuine. And I felt like Scott was genuine. Now, I obviously had my own frustrations with Scott, especially over the last year. Who didn't, right? And who doesn't with their favorite team's manager and coach, etc. But overall, I am just appreciative of how Scott handled this thing as a whole. Obviously, it's very disappointing how things have gone for the most part. All the times falling just short of the playoffs. But at the end of the day, this is the second winningest manager in Mariners history. And that's for a reason, right? That's absolutely for a reason. All right, so that is going to do it for our show. Colby's heading out of town tomorrow, so we'll see. There is potentially a window where we'll be able to record, but we'll see. We might just let the dust settle and let you guys, kind of sit on this for the weekend, and we'll see how the first series in the Dan Wilson era goes. That's going to be weird and interesting to get used to. But before we get out of here, a reminder that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. For Colby Patnode, I'm Tiding Gonzalez. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter at LO_Mariners. You can follow me at Tiding Gonzalez and Colby at CPAT11. That's CPAT11. You can also find all that stuff in the description of this episode. Now head on over to Locked On Seahawks to get all the latest on the Hawks from Corbin Smith and the gang, and tell them Ty and Colby sent you. Have yourself a beautiful baseball day, and we'll see you next time. Peace.